I'm going to give you the standard book launch spiel. Apologies for that, but it kind of summarizes the experience of going back and looking at a book you wrote 5 years ago and seeing that the world's entirely different from how it was 5 years ago, and most of the things you thought then were probably wrong, which is a fascinating and traumatic experience for any author. And I've just come through the other side. So it's going to look at what's changed in the last 5 years. The first edition, which was red, yeah, you can just about see it, can't you? The first edition, which was red, made a very, sort of was a kind of survey of Oxfam's experience of development and argued that the key factors in driving successful development were this combination of active citizens, nice and comfortable, we all believe in active citizens, and effective states, a bit more edgy, a bit more difficult, an attempt to answer the China question, you know, looking at how development actually happens in that interaction between citizens and states. And the basic sort of uber message of the first edition, and even more so in the second edition, is that we have had an amazingly good 60 years. You wouldn't think it to look at Oxfam propaganda, but actually in terms of all the indicators, health, education, rights, democracy, voice, women's position, the last 60 years have been an unprecedented period of progress in human history. And it is entirely feasible to complete that task. I was looking at the numbers today. To eradicate $1.25 a day poverty from the globe would cost $66 billion a year, right? We're just working out the numbers for a bit of media stuff later this week, but it looks like the top 100 people in the world increased their wealth by four times that much last year, right? So top 100 people take half their income, and you could eradicate world poverty twice over. You know, this is not an impossible task. Well, it shouldn't be an impossible task. So that is the kind of the prize, and the threat is, of course, this kind of increasing sense that we are banging up against planetary boundaries, not just on climate, but on a range of other sort of natural resource related issues, but also that there are some other sort of systemic problems like the financial system, which no one quite knows what to do about, but are starting to look increasingly serious as threats to this extraordinary project. So looking at the last 5 years, what's changed, if you can't read it at the back, he wasn't a lot of fun before he lost confidence in the world financial system. The global financial crisis, you know, it's a really difficult thing for NGOs to work on. For some reason, no one really wants to know what Oxfam thinks about bond markets and derivatives and stuff like that. But it's incredibly important. And what we've seen from the extent of the global financial crisis, stroke European North American financial crisis of 2008, is that the financial sector has an enormous capacity to disrupt. It also has a capacity to do good, but they tend to be different bits of the financial sector. And we saw an enormous shock delivered to the global economy, and it doesn't appear to have gone away. We seem to be in a period of sort of lasting financial instability with big implications for investment, financial flows, exchange rates, and lots of other very dull and important things. Poor people, they actually had a different crisis from the rest of us. It was the food price spike in 2008. So what you had then was an end to a period of 30 years of stable and declining food prices. And from 2008 onwards, they've sort of gone haywire. There's been, I think, 3 spikes last time I looked. Troughs, countries banning exports, pushing up prices, big rows over land grabs because the food insecure countries with money are grabbing big chunks of land in Africa and Asia in particular. So mayhem around the food system. And you know, in countries like Bangladesh, where 70–80% of household income is spent on food, if food prices double, do the math, something has to give. And we're doing an interesting project monitoring this in 10 countries, just doing focus group interviews with, mainly with women in one urban and one rural setting, just to watch over the next 4 years what's happening with the nature of food and the role of food in people's lives. And then the third big shock, I mean the book, you know, the new edition says there are 3 big shocks in the last 5 years, was a positive shock so far. So the Arab Spring, no one predicted it. It made us think a lot more about how do you work as an NGO when you don't know what's going to happen, which kind of describes the Arab Spring for us. You know, fantastic sort of validation of the focus on citizenship, on women in particular in the Islamic context. We've been doing a fair amount of work on that before, but yeah, that's just become much more salient now because of what's been going on in North Africa. And it really showed us that we weren't ready for this. It took us a couple of months after the Arab Spring started for us to stop talking about it as a potential humanitarian disaster and to start thinking that it actually was rather a big political opportunity. And it just really exposed, made us think we're not very good at seizing opportunities which suddenly come along. We like plans, log frames, all that stuff, and how nimble are we actually at responding to opportunities. And beneath all that, there's been a slow-motion train wreck on climate, political train wreck in terms of 2009, Copenhagen. 2009 was an amazing year. That it was the combination of Copenhagen and the financial crisis. You could sort of feel the global centre of power move almost as you watched. So in 2009, the G8 officially passed on the baton to the G20. Europe was humiliated in Copenhagen, and nothing's really been the same since. So I think there are some really big geopolitical shifts in the last 5 years, but also just climate chaos on the ground. We're just, the first edition did actually talk about climate change as a future threat to some extent, and there's no way anyone can do that now. So, a big shift there. Okay, so that's the sort of the shifts in the world out there, and then the rest of this is going to be a bit on how has that affected the way we think about development and some of the sort of debates which are currently whizzing around. So the first one is, where do poor people live? You gave aid to poor countries, tried to strengthen government, civil society, so that they could become less poor. Currently, 80% of poor people live in middle-income countries. That's because the countries have upgraded. The people haven't moved. They've stayed in the same countries by and large, but the countries have moved up to middle-income status. Now, that's not just a sort of categorization question. Actually, in middle-income countries, the debates are different. It's far more is about local taxation, natural resource revenues from oil and gas and mining, and it's a domestic politics question. And ending poverty in those countries where 80% of the poor people live is very different. In terms of its implications for organisations like Oxfam or Practical Action, it's much more about strengthening voices within domestic politics than talking about aid. And that's a big shift. If you look down the road for a couple of decades, there's a current big nerd war going on between one group of people at the ODI who say, actually, the vast majority of poor people in 20 years will be in fragile states. And that's going to be where the focus of development is. And another group of people, based in King's College, who say, no, they're still going to be mainly middle-income countries. So that's a bit, and then there's lots of middle-income fragile states, just to complicate the question. But if it's fragile states, then we've got a problem, because that's the hardest place to do anything in development. And if that's where most poor people end up, then development is going to find itself being left with the hardest tasks, which is what you'd expect, because the easiest tasks you've done. And you're left with the really difficult ones. But that's a live debate. Whenever I say things have got better on gender issues in Oxfam, I'm normally sort of dragged from the room and slaughtered. But I think there are some really impressive signs of progress on women's participation in particular, rising women's participation at parliamentary level, but also at local government level in many countries, with lots of research showing just what effects that has, what positive effects that has on governance itself. Progress in the UN, creating a single UN Women with Michelle Bachelet in charge. A World Development Report on gender inequality, which would be pretty inconceivable 10, 15 years ago. The flagship World Bank publication. So lots of things going on gender issues, but it tends to be what I call women for development. So it's like, if you educate women, they work more. If you keep them healthy, they're more productive. And so you get this sort of model of the perfect developmental woman is she cooks the breakfast, goes out to work, works an 8-hour day, comes back, feeds the kids, goes out to the community meeting in the evening, maybe digs a couple of trenches for sewage, and then has 2 hours sleep and then starts it all again. That's the kind of the nirvana that the gender and development people have achieved. And there's much less progress on development for women. How do we factor in the care economy, the double, triple, quadruple burden that women face into the way we think about policy? So I think there's a sort of mixed on gender. all these shocks have made us think that actually we're looking in the wrong place. If you ask poor people what it's like being poor, and it's a surprisingly infrequent question, actually. The best study of that was done by the World Bank in the 90s. It really needs to be redone now, called Voices of the Poor, and they asked 64,000 poor people in 23 countries, what's it like? And the message that comes over is not, I've got 99 cents a day. If I just had $1.01 a day, everything would be different. It's fear, anxiety, shame, humiliation, irritation, frustration, rage, exhaustion, lots of things which are harder to measure. And one of the things that really emerges is that if something goes wrong tomorrow, if the breadwinner gets injured, if somebody gets sick, if a daughter gets married and requires a massive investment in the marriage, we don't know how we're going to manage that. But it's likely to knock us back for years, and you get these kind of shocks in income which take years to rebuild. So it's this sense of volatility at personal and household level, and with climate and finance and all the rest of it at community and national level, has made us think a lot more about the dynamics of these things. Instead of thinking about, are you on average $1 a day, $1.25, $1.50, you're thinking much more about what happens if there's a shock. Do you have a safety net to help you? Do you have reserves? How can public policy help you get through these ups and downs? Do you need more food reserves to cope with a time when the food runs out or when food prices go very high? So it's a lot more about smoothing and stabilizing volatility and not just on averages that it was before. And we're also linked to that, thinking more about the nature of poverty, about what makes people feel fulfilled, and why aren't we measuring that? So I went to this great conference in Korea a couple of years ago, 2,000 statisticians and a token NGO. And the head of the stats body from South Korea, who was hosting it, said, look, we tell our people that we are a development miracle. No one has ever developed as fast or as consistently over 2 generations as Korea, and yet we have the highest suicide rate and the lowest birth rate in the OECD. There's clearly a gap between what we're measuring and what people are experiencing. And the national governments are way ahead of the NGOs on this. The British government, they're all actually trying to measure and understand well-being, because this is what gets you re-elected apart from anything else. And there's some really interesting progress in terms of measuring what matters to people rather than just GDP. Is the American military map of Afghanistan. Okay? And it partly explains why they're leaving, but it's actually a pretty good mind map. And it's an attempt to understand a complex system. Now, a complex system is one where it doesn't matter how hard you study it, you will never be able to predict what's going to happen. And that actually describes most developmental situations. And yet development has this weird structural process that we plan. And in order to plan, we claim to be able to say, if we do this, then this will happen. So there's a sort of fundamental clash between the nature of complex systems, which is unpredictable change, Arab Spring style, and the log frame world of development agencies, which although no one actually believes it, we have to proceed as if change was linear and that you can trace cause and effect. Right? And this is making people think, I summarize this as, what do you do when you don't know what's going to happen? And you can do things. You can plan for not knowing what's going to happen. But it's a very different way of thinking. So the US military, or the Marines rather, US Marines, when they go into combat, don't have a log frame saying, 30 people will go there, 40 people will go there, we'll have these guns and this will happen. They say, stay in communication, take the high ground, keep moving, and we'll improvise the rest. Right? Now that sounds like a good development strategy. Or, not exactly, but as a model. And it's that sort of approach which is increasingly what we're going to need as we understand that systems are complex rather than linear. In 2009, we all thought G20, new World Steering Committee, okay, low-income countries aren't there, but Brazil and South Africa, and they'll be more sympathetic than the G8. But the G20's actually gone very quiet, and it's much more really like a G0 at the moment, that no one's in charge. There's paralysis on climate change, arms trade, most things that matter, the multilateral system is not delivering. And what you're getting instead is kind of coalitions of the willing popping up And it's very unpredictable. So, you know, Turkey and Brazil decide to launch an initiative on Iran, or you know, the African Union does some really good stuff on gender rights or whatever. And that's actually a real nightmare for advocacy NGOs, because you can't just trog along from G8 summit to G8 summit or G20 summit to G20 summit. You actually have to understand what's going on, which is a real pain. And so you've actually got to be aware of politics, of what coalitions are forming. You've got to have contacts in many more countries, and then you've got to be responsive to these initiatives as they emerge. So horrendous for the advocacy lot. Okay, so this is flows of capital to developing countries. FDI, foreign direct investment, goes up and down like a yo-yo depending on the mood. ODA, aid, goes up slowly but is about to go down. I'm willing to bet money on that. Private debt, hot money, is even more volatile. That one is remittances from workers in the rich countries back to developing countries. That is the impact of a massive global financial crisis in North America and Europe. Basically, migrants just worked extra hard so they could keep sending money home. So remittances are now 3 times the volume of aid, and they're going up about 15% a year, year on year. Massively important. Hardly anybody in development works on them. I came across a really nice little NGO in India, which actually does advice work, both in the state that sends the migrants up to the Punjab and when they arrive in the Punjab, so that you can actually say to people, these are what the going wages are, this is where you can get some accommodation, here's a helpline in case anybody starts giving you, maltreating you. Brilliant piece of work. First time I've ever come across it. The only other place I read about it was 19th century US, where NGOs were meeting people off the boats from Europe doing exactly that. And yet this is not seen as development work, right? Crazy. So migration's definitely coming. Urbanization, every Oxfam strategic plan has, we are about to get serious about urbanization on, and has been like that for 15 years, I think. We seem to have an enormous institutional problem about doing urban. And it depends, and why that is, I have lots of theories. One is, it's just much more fun in rural. It's much more, photogenic. You get garlands, songs. It's just really nice. And you're the only foreigner and the only interesting person in town, so you get all the attention. You go into a shanty town, everybody's drunk, no one cares. It's not nearly as much fun. It's much harder to prove attribution. We did this thing in the village and no one else done anything, so we know it was down to us. Whereas in the shanty town, you go back to talk to the people who you did the project with, and they've all gone. They moved somewhere else. So it's really much harder to do the sort of the monitoring evaluation stuff. And something about development people, I have a horrible suspicion there is some kind of peasant romanticism. All these people living in towns who wouldn't dream of living out there, by and large, just want to keep them there. They really like that peasant thing, and they don't want them to come into the towns, even if they actually, all their kids want to come into the towns. I make a point of always asking children, what do you want to do when you grow up? The number of peasant kids who've said, I really want to be a peasant, very, very small, vanishingly small. Waves of innovation, stuff coming down the road. If you believe The Economist, not enough innovation. If you believe everybody else, especially my age, too much innovation, can't work anything anymore. And Oxfam, something like 5,000 staff, not a single technological advisor. Yeah, that's interesting. Now, why is that? Is it because they're actually called something else? Climate change advisor or something like that? Is it because we're just really scared of technology? It's because we see it as innately dangerous and hostile? And as far as I've got with thinking about this in terms of the Oxfam at least, is that people have a very crude division into nice technologies and nasty technologies. And that's not entirely illogical. The nice technologies are dispersed, accessible, mobile phones, computers, internet, and the nasty ones are anything big. And basically we're against the nasty ones. We don't want geoengineering, we don't want GM, just nuclear, make them go away. And that's probably not good enough, I put it to you. Geoengineering, I would say, is an inevitable part of the response to climate change. And unless we get engaged with it, it's going to screw up poor communities quite badly. And yet we haven't even started thinking about it. And no one in Oxfam knows what nanotechnology is. And yet these things are really going to be important. So a plea to think more about technology, which of course you're all doing, so you can just come and do it for us. So there's not many new ideas come out of Oxfam, I have to admit. But one of them I think is quite interesting, which is done by a colleague called Kate Rayworth, which is she took some interesting work, the outer ring, which is the planetary boundaries, done by the Stockholm Environmental Institute, where they came up with 9 system boundaries to the Earth as a whole, and tried to measure which ones were under threat by human activity. And there's 3, including, actually, I think climate change, we haven't quite breached it, or maybe we have. But anyway, there are 3 which are being breached, the others are at risk. And Kate said, that's great, but there's no people in there. So what's the social floor? What's the minimum decent life we would want for all people, as defined by UN conventions or the submissions to the Rio+20? And then the task is to actually find a way of getting everybody in the ring of the donuts between the social floor and the environmental ceiling. Now, at the moment, this is just like a conceptual framework so that people don't forget either environment or social. But we're trying to develop this and see how far it'll go. We're trying to do this at national and community level in a few countries. And it could be quite interesting. The UN, for some reason, got really obsessed with the donut. And Kate's been on sort of permanent PowerPoint for several months now, talking to them about it. And it's seen as a helpful way to try and get social and environmental onto the same page. Authorial self-indulgence. So what went right and wrong in those sort of between the 2 editions? Inequality and redistribution have definitely gone up the agenda in the last 5 years. So when I talked about inequality in the first edition, I was fine. It was all very angry and NGO-ish. Went to America and I had to delete redistribution from the PowerPoints and put rebalancing, because redistribution was such a taboo word in the States at that point. That's in 2008. I think you can now talk about redistribution carefully, but you can still do it. And yeah, the increasing sort of acknowledgement that there's this 1% problem, 99% problem, all the different ways of looking at inequality, that's all got much more, much richer over the last few years. And the sort of focus on planetary boundaries is saying the cake isn't infinite, therefore how you divide it up matters more. I think the central thesis holds: active citizens, effective states, and the interaction between them. It's amazing how DFID can still say, hand on heart, you have to have democratic governance for development. And you just look at people and say, China? And they go, oh yeah. But there's a danger that our grasp of political economy is really weak, and we believe what we want to be true. And this is saying, no, we actually think that these are components with a sometimes difficult relationship between them, and this is where there's the space between citizen and state that we need to understand much better. My standard thing when I go around Oxfam programs is to say, who are you talking to apart from the state and civil society organisations? And there's usually a completely blank look. And then you say, okay, you have a burgeoning middle class. You have massive faith-based organisations, which the poor people actually trust. You have a private sector. You have traditional authorities, which may be very influential in villages in particular. Are you talking to any of them? And quite often in Oxfam, people aren't. They just have this very crude version of citizen and state and not thinking about what's linking them. So there's a whole kind of, that's the next piece of work is on this power analysis and politics kind of piece, which we need to get better at. The book was partly a kind of visceral dislike of Make Poverty History. I think Make Poverty History was a really stupid campaign. The reason it was stupid was because it implied, it never explicitly said, but it implied that if you sort out debt, aid and trade, you will make poverty history, which is just nonsense. 5 minutes of thinking about that, 1 minute of thinking about that would say that's just stupid. And yet we did it and we got away with it. Isn't that shocking? So the first edition said, no, development is primarily a national process. It's the interaction between citizens and state, and we are second-order players. The aid industry is a second-order player. Actually, global institutions are second-order players. The primary drama is national. I think that's still true, but